For nearly 24 hours, no one could reach Katherine Short. Her phone was silent. Messages went unanswered, and behind the door of her Los Angeles home, questions were quietly building. What happened during those missing hours, and why did the discovery that followed leave even investigators focused on understanding the timeline, rather than searching for suspects? According to publicly available reports and law enforcement sources, this wasn't a case defined by chaos or conflict. Instead, it was marked by silence, privacy, and one detail found nearby that raised deeply personal questions. And the story of those final 24 hours reveals something far more complex than headlines alone can explain. Katherine Short lived largely outside the public spotlight, despite being the daughter of legendary comedian and actor Martin Short. Unlike many children of public figures, she chose privacy over attention, building a life away from constant media coverage. That privacy would later make the timeline of her final day more difficult to piece together. According to reports, concern began not with an emergency, but with absence. A close friend reportedly noticed something unusual. Katherine hadn't responded to calls or messages for nearly a full day. At first, it may not have seemed alarming. People get busy, phones die, life happens. But as the hours passed, that silence became harder to ignore. So the friend made a decision that would soon change everything. They contacted authorities and requested a welfare check. And that's when the situation shifted. Because when officers arrived at Katherine's residence, nothing immediately suggested forced entry or disturbance. The home appeared calm, undisturbed, but one detail stood out. A bedroom door was locked from the inside. That single detail changed how investigators approached the situation, not with urgency driven by danger to others, but with concern for what may have happened behind that closed door. And what they found would confirm that this was not a case investigators were treating as suspicious, but as something far more personal. But that raises an important question. What happened during those 24 hours before anyone realized something was wrong? Because according to law enforcement sources, there were no immediate signs of outside involvement, no evidence pointing to anyone else entering or leaving. Instead, the focus became understanding Katherine's final known movements and what may have been happening internally rather than externally. When officers made entry into the locked room, they discovered Katherine unresponsive. Emergency responders confirmed she had passed away. Later reports indicated the cause was a self-inflicted injury, and authorities ruled out foul play based on the evidence available. This distinction mattered, because from an investigative standpoint, the case shifted away from questions of who and toward questions of when and why. And it was another detail nearby that added emotional weight to the situation. According to sources cited in multiple reports, a written note was found close to where Katherine was discovered. Its contents were never publicly released, and that decision to keep those details private reflected something important. This was not treated as public evidence. It was treated as something deeply personal. But that raises another question. Why did this moment remain so private, despite the public identity of her family? And how did those closest to her respond in the days that followed? In situations like this, public attention often arrives faster than answers. But in Katherine's case, something unusual happened. There were no public statements filled with dramatic details, no press conferences, no extended explanations. Instead, there was silence. And that silence, according to many observers, reflected the same privacy Katherine had maintained throughout her life. Because while headlines focused on the timeline, those closest to her were focused on something else entirely: respect. Respect for her life beyond the final day. Respect for the person she was when no one was watching. And to understand that, it helps to look at who Katherine was before that moment. Unlike her father, whose career spanned decades in film, television, and live performance, Katherine stayed largely out of the entertainment spotlight. She pursued her own interests, built her own routines, and maintained a quieter presence. This choice wasn't accidental. Growing up connected to a globally recognized public figure can create constant attention. But Katherine reportedly chose a different path. She lived independently, privately, and for years that privacy remained intact, which makes one detail stand out even more: the fact that concern came not from the public, but from a friend, Not from media speculation, not from public absence, but from someone who knew her personally enough to notice when something wasn't right. That detail changes how the story is understood. Because it wasn't visibility that revealed the situation, it was connection. And that raises another important question. How did investigators determine there was no outside involvement so quickly? According to law enforcement sources referenced in reports, several key observations helped establish the timeline. The locked door, the absence of forced entry, and the lack of evidence suggesting anyone else was present. These details allowed investigators to focus on documenting the timeline rather than pursuing external suspects. And once foul play was ruled out, the case transitioned from a criminal investigation to a confirmed personal tragedy. But for the public, the emotional impact extended beyond investigative conclusions. Because while investigators seek closure through facts, families seek something else entirely: understanding and privacy. In the days that followed, Martin Short did not immediately speak publicly about the loss, and that decision reflected something many people overlook. Grief doesn't follow a schedule. It doesn't arrive on cue for cameras or public statements. It happens quietly, often away from view, but even without public words, the absence itself communicated something powerful. Because sometimes silence is not avoidance. Sometimes it's protection. Protection of memories. Protection of dignity. Protection of a person's story beyond their final chapter. And this moment became a reminder of something broader: how quickly public narratives form, and how little they sometimes reflect the full human experience behind them. Because headlines focus on events, but lives are defined by everything that came before, which leads to the deeper question many people began asking afterward: not just what happened, but who Katherine was beyond that moment, and why her story continues to resonate with people who never knew her personally. What makes stories like Katherine's resonate isn't public exposure, but human relatability. Because her life, by all public accounts, wasn't defined by controversy or public conflict. It was defined by normalcy, independence, privacy. And that's what makes the timeline so difficult for many people to process. Because from the outside, nothing appeared dramatically different. No public warning signs, no widely visible changes. No moment captured in real time that signaled what was coming. Just a gradual silence that only one person noticed soon enough to act. And that moment, the friend choosing to call for help, reveals something deeply important. Connection doesn't require constant visibility. It requires awareness. It requires care. And sometimes it requires trusting your instincts when something feels off. Authorities, after completing their review, confirmed there was no indication of outside involvement. The available evidence aligned with a deeply personal situation, not a criminal one. That conclusion allowed the case to close from an investigative standpoint. But emotionally, stories like this never fully close, because they leave behind questions that don't have simple answers, not investigative questions, human ones, questions about pressure, about privacy, about the invisible weight people can carry while appearing completely normal from the outside. And perhaps most importantly, questions about how people choose to live their lives outside of public attention. Katherine never built her identity around fame. She built it around privacy. And in the end, that privacy remained intact. Even as public curiosity grew, the most personal details were never shared publicly. And that boundary mattered because it preserved something essential: her humanity beyond headlines. In the end, the story of Katherine Short isn't defined by a single day. It's defined by everything that came before it: her independence, her privacy, and the quiet life she chose to live away from constant public attention. And it also highlights something broader about how quickly moments can change, and how important it is to notice the people around us, even in quiet ways. But this raises a larger question that extends far beyond one person or one timeline. How many stories remain completely unseen until someone pauses long enough to notice the silence? Sometimes the most important stories aren't the loudest ones. They're the quiet ones people almost miss.